My name is, excuse me, it's Sister Rosine Stavzak, and I would like to tell you about the speaker for this evening, Mr. Phil Cousineau. I don't know how you believe different things or not, but I think that there's an underground something that connects people when you don't even know that you're being connected to somebody. So I came across Phil's name in the Spiritus magazine at the University of Detroit put out. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to find him and see if he could do this talk. So you know how you go through an institution and one another, and then finally, you know, you got a connection. So that's how I found Phil. And he wrote me, I got his book over there. He said something about Rosine, a fellow seeker. And I guess that's exactly how it happened and how it is. Anyway, I've got a whole page and a half of information about this man, but I kind of will highlight some things. He's a freelance writer, a documentary, a filmmaker, independent scholar, and a worldwide lecturer, storyteller, and creativity consultant. He grew up just outside of Detroit, which is known as the Paris of the Midwest, he said, but he moonlighted in a steel factory while studying journalism and photography at the University of Detroit. His lifelong fascination with the art, literature, and history of culture has taken him on myriad journeys around the world. He had written over 25 documentary film credits, included The Hero's Journey, The Life and Work of Joseph Campbell, Ecological Design, et cetera, et cetera. And he had stories from the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was nominated in 1991 for an Academy Award. And since then, he has put things on PBS and live TV. He has written a lot about mythology in various areas like sports and art, etc. And he had worked for several Warner Brothers DVDs, including The Natural Order of Women, Batman, and Superman Deluxe. Excuse me, and a few others. He was invited to lecture in many different venues: the University of California, Berkeley, Stanford University, Syracuse University, and the University of Indiana. And at the Pacifica Graduate Institute, he was the judge for several Emmys in San Francisco Film Festival, and he's a story consultant for Warner Brothers, Lucasfilm, Pixar, and 21st Century Fox, among other things here. Since 1984, he has led art, literature, and mythology study programs and tours all over the world. And believe me, we set this up, and when he was in Italy, then he came back, and we talked about he went to France, so it was touch and go that we connected. He did tours in Greece, Ireland, France, England, Italy, and Cuba. He has been featured in Time and Newsweek and many other places too. So in November, he was featured in the Spiritus, the alumni magazine of the University of Detroit Mercy. He lives with his wife and his son on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco. He has been on a journey his whole life, and I'm so happy to know that he will share his insights with us today. So Phil, you're on.
Thank you. I want to be sure that you can hear me. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sister Rosine, for a wonderful introduction. Yes, I guess we were meant to meet, right? You never know where these published magazine articles will find you, and I'm glad that one found you. So since you mentioned my origins there in Detroit, maybe we could start there. I grew up in probably one of the last homes in America that read books out loud together. Can you imagine that? In the 1960s, our 6-foot tall Philco black and white television broke, and my father spent about 5 minutes trying to fix it, couldn't, and compelled me to help him drag the TV out of the living room through the kitchen, and then he kicked it down into the basement, turned around and dramatically announced, "We're going to read books out loud together as a family." And we did that Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. Most of the years I was growing up, from about 8 to 14 or so. Mark Twain, Grimm's fairy tales, Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the younger versions when we were young, and then more elaborate versions. And yet, what's very pertinent for a presentation and talk like this, as brief as it will be, is that my father also created, I think, out of sheer intuition, his own form of pedagogy. Do you remember that wonderful old word? It's the science of the study of teaching itself. We would read a book, let's say a younger version of Moby Dick by Herman Melville, and then we would all pile into the Ford station wagon and drive from Detroit all the way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, to the home of Herman Melville. That was, I think, a brilliant teaching device, that we would read about the Greeks, and then we would actually go down to the, let's say, the Toledo Art Museum to look at an exhibition of sculpture. Why? He thought that we needed to read as background, and then we needed to see the world, we being his children, we need to see the world for ourselves. And that is actually something that has inspired my entire life. As Sister said, I graduated with degrees in photography, filmmaking, journalism, and yet, despite being offered a job at the Detroit Free Press, which would have been a wonderful way to lead my life, Detroit was very violent in those years. It was the most violent city in the world, the murder capital of the world, if you recall. And so I needed a break from Detroit, including the fact that I had been working in a Detroit steel factory to help my family all those years. So I left for 3 months, told my college girlfriend, my best buddies, my family, I'd be back in September, just like the old song. And I came back 3 years later. So what happened? I just gave a talk. I was honored at the Detroit Public Library a few years ago, and this phrase kept just jumped out of my mouth. In some ways, I wish I'd been able to pull it back, but I couldn't. I was going to college in those years when Detroit was in a kind of cult of death. Everybody talked about death, danger, crime. The industry was depressed. Everyone was depressed. There was no such thing as ordinary social life. Detroit was too dangerous in those years. So I fly first to London, then to Paris, then to Athens, Cairo. I began to see the world, and I woke up into a cult of life. Can you feel the shift there? That informed those first few months on the road from me, 1974, really informed my life with what I think you just said, Sister. It's in a lot of my bio material. I've been in search of the soul of the world. That was a phrase I grew up with, going to Wayne St. Mary's, a traditional Catholic school, French Catholic school, just outside Detroit. But those were also the years of Motown, rhythm and blues, soul music. I used to see Miles Davis and Ray Charles in the local Detroit clubs. So soul was not a theological construct for me. It wasn't an abstract notion. It was very real. Soul meant the center, the essence, the fundamental truth of something or somebody or a city, the soul of a city, as we used to say in filmmaking. And that's what I set out in search of, in a sense, to bring myself back to life. And believe it or not, that is one of the most ancient formulas for pilgrimage. That's what I want to offer today. Sister asked me to somehow weave together a talk about my notion of the art of pilgrimage, which came out 25 years ago. It's in 15 languages, hundreds of thousands of copies. And the success of the book astounds me, but it also speaks to the theme that I see on your website, and I've heard from Sister Rosine, is an essential matter to all of you, and that's the overlap between spirituality, ecology, and the social structures of the world, and so on. We'll fill in some of those gaps. How can I help with this? Pilgrimage, I discovered, is one of the most ancient human rituals of behavior. If you count the Australian Aborigine walkabout, which I do as a bona fide pilgrimage, this tradition is 60,000 years old. That's how long Aborigines have been going on walkabout. My friend, the great theologian, historian of religion, Houston Smith, who married my wife and I, is my son's godfather, called it the world's oldest tradition. And what does it have in common with, let's say, medieval pilgrimage, which most people would be attracted to or concerned with, or the modern notion of pilgrimage? It's right in the word. 3 of my many books are about word origins. This goes also back to my childhood, where we had a huge doorstop of a dictionary in the living room when we were reading books out loud. And if we came across one we didn't understand, my father insisted that we walk across the living room, open up the dictionary, and see for ourselves what the word meant. That has been a lifelong practice for me. So I look up seriously in a dictionary the origin of every word I use when I write books, films, TV, radio scripts, so I know what I'm talking about. This is a beauty, in case you haven't looked it up yourself. Pilgrim originates in the notion of per agram. It means to walk through the fields. So already we're in the realm of ecology, oikos. Remember, ecology means home, H-O-M-E in ancient Greek. It's the study of what it means to be home or homeless in the world. Pilgrimage is this urge to see the world for ourselves in a moment of crisis, a moment of crossroad, to get off the couch, turn off the television, leave the neighborhood, and go and seek something. So the working definition in my book, as we can go through a few of the stages of this, and then bring it back to your fascination with ecology and the sustainability of the world, is that it's a spiritually transformative journey to a sacred place. Mere tourism, it's a word that goes back. We know precisely where it began. Thomas Cook, if any of you are old enough to remember Thomas Cook traveler's checks and the what do they call it, the travel agencies, he led the first official tour, which meant taking a group from Birmingham in the north of England on a tour down to London and then back again. But traditionally, tourism just means to see the superficial aspect of a place, what's ordinary, what the locals want you to enjoy, admire, and preferably buy something. Pilgrimage and change is not really an issue in the world of tourism. You go to be entertained, you go to be distracted, you go to relieve anxiety, right? Who doesn't need that? But we also go, again, this is more wordplay, to vacate our minds. That's the origin of vacation. We do not want to think when we're on the beach in Hawaii or Bali. The pilgrimage, especially in the realm I want to talk about today, is meant to be transformative. You are looking for some kind of answers. They could be personal, spiritual, artistic. Many of my pilgrimages are in the search of authors and artists and filmmakers, or architecturally, change politically in terms of political activism. You'll see I have a sign that Martin Luther King's March on Washington was officially presented as a prayer pilgrimage. And I think that's interesting for our presentation today. So I got the idea for the book. People always want to know about ideas. Very briefly, and then we'll go into some slides and we'll have some fun with this, and there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. I had just finished one book. I was hoping to have a break of sorts. Really, you pour everything, mind, body, and soul into completing a book. I thought I was going to take a break, and then I opened up this New York Times Sunday travel section one day, and I see what they used to call a little bullet piece, a small article, just 2 or 3 lines of general interest, right? And the headline captured me. By the year 2000, travel, it announced, was going to overcome the armaments industry as the biggest business in the world. Now, if you are religiously inclined, you might think of the prophecy in the Old Testament of turning swords into plowshares. Do you remember that? It's even in the language, 3,000 years. That is what began to happen in 1997. Between 1997 and the year 2000, with the huge jubilee of pilgrims that went to Rome, 50,000 people descended on Rome to celebrate the Christian jubilee.
Are you listening to this
Hello?
pilgrimage?
Hello?
Yes, I am.
Okay. We're okay? And so I, as a good writer, journalist, I had to ask a simple question. Why? Why would there be such a huge surge of travel and overcome something that was obviously and obscenely the biggest, most profitable business in the world, which is guns and ammunition? So a little bit of homework told me it was the rise of pilgrimage. Traditionally, more people going to Jerusalem and Rome, but also the very famous now march to Santiago de Compostela, which people like Shirley MacLaine wrote about and sold 3 million books writing about her experience. But the word began to be used right in the late 1990s to also describe any profoundly important journey that you might take that would bring about either personal or social change. So the word was being used to go on safari in Africa, but also cultural pilgrimages, let's say to Monet's gardens in Giverny or James Joyce's house in Dublin. I went to my publisher and I said, let's get ahead of this. Let's write about this. It's about to overtake the travel world. So I did. In 1998, the book came out and it's been in print and in many languages around the world. And what does it celebrate? I think it's these. Remember the movie The Accidental Tourist? I feel like the accidental pilgrim. We did go on some traditional journeys, especially because my mother was of great faith, as we used to say in those days. So we went on some religious pilgrimages. But this one caught me by surprise. And yet, as I began doing the research and interviewing people, compiling my stories and photographs, I had the oddest realization. And I hope a few of you listening today will have something similar. And that's that I've been on pilgrimages all my life. I just didn't call it that. If I am determined to go to the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame or to go on the Jerusalem March, which I did when I lived in Israel, 29 miles from my kibbutz to touch the Wailing Wall of Solomon there in Jerusalem, I was on pilgrimages over and over again, sacred and secular. And this is later the kind of thinking that I used, coming full circle, just as we now go into the slides, that I used when I wrote 2 books on ecological design and 2 different films. The first was called exactly that, Ecological Design. It is still being Reinventing the Future was the interesting subtitle. And then the follow-up was something called City 21. It was a documentary which we shot in 9 countries around the world, in which we addressed the enormous question, what will urban life be like in the future? So when I would go to film in these different sites, I would do a great deal of work seeking out futurists, architects, educators. I was on a pilgrimage in the sense that it is almost a fever-browed quest for meaning. Most modern travel, most tourism is based on distraction, is based on social one-upmanship. But pilgrimage is a journey in search of meaning. So, my friend, could we go to the second slide here? John? Okay, thank you. This is a place I've just come back from. Does anybody recognize it out there? One of the most important sites in antiquity, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. I lead tours, mythic tours to Greece, sometimes also spiritual ones in the footsteps of John and Paul.
Invite.
And what we're doing is recreating
Default
a
email.
pilgrimage.
Gmail. Yeah.
Hello?
Choose your email service.
Oh, sorry, can you mute in the background? I can't hear
Oh.
myself. Thank you. Thank you. So for maybe 1,500 to 2,000 years, it was a much honored, much revered pilgrimage in antiquity, in the Mediterranean, in the Aegean, to go to Delphi for reasons that pilgrims have been going on pilgrimages for 60,000 years, right up till recently. And that is your friends, the ministers, your nuns, your best friends, your wife, your spouse, your husband can no longer help you. Excuse me, you are at a crisis, a crossroad. And this is the moment, I call this, the pilgrim moment, when you need to leave home and go on a walk to a sacred place that has been revered, that people have held in awe and wonder, sometimes for millennia, like this site, and ask a question there. So very, very briefly, the tradition here would have been, if you left Athens, one of the Greek islands, or the even sometimes Central Europe, Northern Africa, you would go to Delphi and ask, should I go to war? Should I plant wheat or barley? Should I get married? A woman might ask, should I have another child? You would ask then this question to the Delphic oracle, who was a middle-aged woman who it was believed was answering for Apollo. And she would answer you in a deep, guttural voice in a question. Sometimes I like to think of this as early therapy. Just like your therapist might say, so what do you think, Phil? What do you think, Sister Rosine? What do you think, John? This is what happened when you went to Delphi. So the site, this is what you're looking at in my slide here, is the Temple of Apollo. And right in the very center would have been a tiny chamber where you would have a few moments alone with the oracle, and you would ask the most probing question of your life. So this is then becomes the model for the way that I go on in search of a story as a journalist, in search of film answers. If I'm interviewing people, I'm looking for the source of it. The many answers that might come up in the search of a documentary film, but also when I'm leading groups. I've led probably 40 tours around the world since the early 1980s. And in every one, I ask people a week before they leave home, what is the deepest probing question in your life right now? What is the one you can't quite get a handle on? It could be cosmic in the sense of, does God really exist? With all of the human torment, it's the oldest question in the world, right? Does God exist? Or it could be just deeply personal. Do I stay in my marriage or do I start over? You bring a question like this and you take it to the sacred site. There are oracle-like sites virtually all around the world. And this is how I like to both travel myself personally, especially when I'm writing, but also it's how I like to lead my own tours. Next slide, please. Nope. There we go. This happens to be, I hope you can see it fairly clearly there. This happens to be Paul Gauguin, the French painter's last painting. It's enormous. It's something like 11 feet wide. And in French, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that he asks three questions, which in English are, where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? It was unusual in the 1890s when he painted this, or the early 20th century, to actually write anything on a painting. But I've come to love this as one of the great mythic paintings of modern times, because there is so much doubt and anger and confusion about our spiritual life, and now about the planet itself. And so on a pilgrimage, one trick I learned from Houston Smith, again, the great historian of religion, was that your pilgrimage is a chance to ask questions that you don't tend to get around to at home. or even if you're in the world of political activism, to quiet down all the competing voices, the babble of ideas about how we might mend the world, tikkun olam, right? And this painting then becomes mythic because it stands in for the metaphysical question that we have had. I date it back to the two world wars. And I don't generally tend to put numbers on this, but it's estimated 20 million people died in World War I and about 110 million people. I'll say that again. 110 million people died in World War II. And as many poets, filmmakers, philosophers said in the years just after 1945, is it even permissible to make art anymore? Is it permissible to go to church after we have collided with the reality of our violent selves? Which is why we turn to art again and again, and to pilgrimage. I'm finding that even though this might be an alarming number to you, I think the church attendance in America now is under 40%. But in Europe, mainland Europe, it's down to 5 to 10%, depending on the country. So the traditional ways of us getting our spiritual sustenance and our mythology about why we are here, where are we going, and so on, all of that is thrown up in the air. And so people are going less and less to church, but a fascinating aspect of this is that monasteries, churches, nunneries, convents all across Europe are being turned into contemplative centers. And young people, 20, 30, 40s, who generally would not be caught dead in a church, are going for 2, 3, 4 week sabbaticals, quiet retreats, often called pilgrimages, to take a breath, to think about things that are deeply important to your spiritual life or your political activism in our case. Slide, please. So if you were to pin me down and ask, well, where are we? I'd be hard pressed to go any further than this. H.G. Wells wrote this in 1899 in his enormous compendium called The History of the World. Ambitious title, right? And in that book, he has a line, a quote, an observation that is probably more pertinent than ever. History is a race between education and catastrophe. Catastrophe being a great old word. Education, you know these as well as I do, drawing out. It's a race, and we do not know which will finish first, so to speak. But a little sideline on this, one of my heroes and someone I did a film on, Buckminster Fuller, sometimes called the American Leonardo da Vinci. It's someone I met in college. He came to U of D to speak. My father knew him. He once said, there are two ways of looking at life and living life. Either we are living out a mythology, and that's the word he used, of scarcity, which turns people mean, angry, confused. It pits people against each other. If you feel we are living in a world of want, a world of need. Or the second mythology, in the deepest sense of that word mythology, is that we are living in a world of abundance. And there is plenty of money, plenty of food, plenty of homes to go around. We are just not distributing these well. So you'll see already, I'm beginning now to use a word that brings together many of my fascinations. Home was a combustible word for me growing up in Detroit. Bucky used it in all of his work. I use it as one of the threads in my film about him. And as you'll see in an upcoming slide, I've just come back from a month in Ithaca, in not New York, but Greece itself, where Odysseus, of course, comes from. And Ithaca has become, for about 3,000 years, 2,700 to be exact, it's become a metaphor in the West for home. The difficulty of leaving home, the difficulty of cultivating and protecting home, and then the tragedy of getting home again. All of this is buried in our word nostalgia. Nostalgia actually means, in ancient Greek, the pain of going home again. So after even looking at some of your literature about what you're doing with this magnificent movement of yours, the Save movement, it's a way in the lens that I would put on as a filmmaker is that you are trying to save home. There's a baseball metaphor in there as well as a mythology metaphor. So I will be going back and forth to the home metaphor as we go along here. John, slide, please. And how can this be useful to you, to your group, to all of us? My basic metaphor is that the pilgrimage begins in crisis, either a spiritual crisis, an economic crisis, a health crisis. There was a local writer here in Stanford, I'm in San Francisco now, who wrote a magnificent book, The Age of Pilgrimage. I think his title is 500-600 pages. And he has an interesting theory that this enormous surge of medieval pilgrimage came about because of the Black Death, the plague. 2/3 of Europe was wiped out. And people stopped believing in medicine. They stopped believing in all authority figures, from the church to the medical. And it made people vulnerable to, or open to looking for alternatives. And that meant that many of the church centers, from Ireland to the Middle East, to Jerusalem, then began to, in a sense, market themselves as centers of healing. This then is one of the oldest notions that the world, our personal world and the earth itself, is in crisis and needs healing. This is one of the oldest functions of pilgrimage, another overlap for us. Slide, please. Thank you, John. So this is another way to think about this. Angkor Wat. If any of you have read my book, The Art of Pilgrimage, you'll know that I begin, of all places in the book, in Cambodia, in Angkor Wat. And real briefly, the reason was because my father had died a few years before, and I went on a pilgrimage there with my brother Paul in honor of my dad, our dad. This is another function of pilgrimage in which the act of going somewhere special, sacred, historically important, is an act of homage. You know, there are pilgrimages every day to the patent office that Albert Einstein worked in Switzerland. There are journeys to Gandhi's home, to the dirt floor hut of Pele, the great soccer player in Brazil. Acts of homage. What do all of these purposes have in common? The need to renew our spiritual energy. Excuse me. So I submit early on, this is kind of a foreshadowing of where I want to go with this talk, is that we may have the best intentions in the world. And believe me, I interviewed some of the greatest architects and ecologists in the world for my 2 films. And all of them had one thing in common. They believed that it was not only a financial and an ecological crisis, but a spiritual one, and one of love and affection. I learned from the great poet Robert Bly many years ago, it's one of the things he said when I worked with him in Ireland, if you don't love where you live, I want to repeat that. If you don't love where you live, you will find a way to destroy it. You won't take care of it. You will look the other way. You will think of only immediate gratification rather than tending, that beautiful word, tending the sanctity of the place where you live. So this is a shot at dusk of Angkor Wat because my dad had bought me, my first book wasn't about baseball as I wanted it to be. It was a book about Angkor Wat. And I promised if he got better, if he healed, I would take him there. We would travel there together, but he died too soon. So I went there with my brother and I found these tumbled down ruins, some of the most beautiful, melancholic ruins in the world. And this is reminiscent to me of the crossroad. The world, unfortunately, good, bad, or indifferent, but it's pretty clear. History teaches us that individuals and cultures do not change until they have to. All of the utopian talk in the world falls short if you try to change things before they are drastic. I guess in our case, we have to look at this as a moment of crisis and react with corresponding alacrity, speed, and care as we do that. Next slide, please. Because in a word there, that site I just showed you, if any of you are interested in pilgrimage sites, sacred architecture, for example, Angkor Wat, take a breath with this, is the most vast spiritual complex in the world. It's 75 square miles of ruins, and only 3% have been excavated. It was considered the center of the world for Buddhism and Hinduism, both. It was a site that combined both beliefs. And yet that word is important because pilgrimage is always about going back to the center. We do not heal ourselves or our neighborhoods or our cultures until we get back and we agree on what is the center so that we can heal it. This seems to suggest, as the great soul singer Sam Cooke did, in the song that he wrote for Martin Luther King, by the way, after the prayer pilgrimage in Washington, change is going to come. Change is what is urgent in pilgrimage, and I think in the greatest, most soul-centered political activism. It's a belief that change is positive. It does not have to be terrifying. And if we, you and I, groups like yours and people like me, if we don't think about what change actually means to people, we're going to fail. Change is terrifying to 90% plus of the human race. Life is difficult enough just to sustain ourselves. You suggest change is coming, economically, spiritually, politically, whatever it is. You have to be ready to take on the onslaught of what that means. Slide, please. So here's another way of thinking about pilgrimage. We're about halfway through the slides here. This is from something I shot in Clonmacnoise in County Clare in Ireland, one of my favorite sites in the world. I'm shooting through the window of what used to be called the scriptorium. As a writer, of course, that's one of my favorite words. This is where monks would be assigned one book to translate from an ancient manuscript into Latin or sometimes into other languages, from the Latin or from the Greek into a local language like the Irish language or French. And one monk would generally spend a lifetime on one single manuscript. It might be the Suda, the equivalent of the Encyclopedia Britannica for the ancient Greeks, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, and so on. So through here, you can see there's one of the great round towers where the monks would have hidden their gold, would have hidden the manuscripts when the Vikings attacked. And I'm using this to kind of take a breath to say, pilgrimage is the sacred journey. Now get ready for the strong double negative here that we can't take. William Saroyan, the great writer, once said a writer is someone who can't write. I've come to think pilgrimage has that urgency to it. If it's something you can say, oh, I'll go next year, then it's not the real thing. You might need a break, you might need a vacation, but a pilgrimage necessitates a complete immersion in a place. It's a movement from the inner to the outer soul that we need. Now, Rosina has asked me to then talk some about soul. For one reason or another, I have soul in the title of 5 of my books. And it's a word that we loved growing up in Detroit. It's a synonym for me for the spark. Meister Eckhart called soul the spark of the flint of God. Soul is the center. It's the essence. It's the authentic versus the spurious. So when I talk about going on a journey somewhere to find the soul of a place, I want the real thing with a capital R. And that's at the heart of pilgrimage. And it's only the encounter with the soul that brings spiritual renewal, including political. Slide, please. Thank you, John. Thanks for helping. Another way to think about it, this is the great church, so deliberately silhouetted shot on Patmos. Right behind this beautiful tower is the cave where, according to the legend, St. John slept, fell asleep with his cheek on the cave wall. And when he woke up, and when he went to sleep, he had the vision of the apocalypse. And when he woke up, his cheek had made a huge indentation into the cave wall, which, if you go there as a pilgrim now, you can still see that indentation. You can touch it if you want to. But here's a wonderful formula. One of the great theologians of our time, Reinhold Niebuhr, and also very ecologically hip, by the way, is a wonderful saying, the pilgrim is the poet who makes journeys. In other words, you're not just traveling to see something trendy because you read about it in Condé Nast magazine, or someone at a cocktail party said you had to go somewhere. A pilgrim is a poet who is looking for, finds, and creates beauty. The pilgrim has been revered in every culture throughout human history. There is a charge, you might say, around someone who is on a determined journey. Slide, please. So if anybody likes this image, I can send it to either John or Sister, and you're free to use it. This, of course, is one that a circle that I adapted from Joe Campbell, who I worked with for many years. Remember, I interviewed him. I wrote the movie about his life, The Hero's Journey. And then my first book was based on my work, many years of work with Campbell. His notion, his breakthrough, and this is, if you remember one thing about this brief talk, this might be it. You notice the direction of the arrows. They're counterclockwise. That's what makes a real journey or a real story. Ordinary time, chronological time, is clockwise. That's when things have a beat, but boom, but boom, but boom. You get up in the morning, you go to work, you come home at night, you feed the kids and the dog, and you go to sleep, to-doom, to-doom, to-doom. But the creative journey, the hero journey, the soul journey, all go against time. That's why it feels like you're 3 weeks in Chartres were 3 months. It's why you feel like a 2-hour movie lasts for hours and hours, or a love affair. All of these break time and space. That's a phrase from Mircea Eliade. So you'll notice I've just adapted Joe's notion of the hero's journey from the movie I wrote so that we can use it for the pilgrim's journey. They begin with longing. You something in your soul needs an answer that you can't find at home. You get a call of some kind. It could be, hey, Phil Cousineau is leading a group to Chartres. Maybe I'll go there. Or you see a movie, Mindland Kundera talks about how beautiful Prague is. You leave, and then you notice you go down through this, enter a dream world, following the pilgrim's road. Eventually, if you are on a real pilgrimage, a real journey, you will enter into the labyrinth. Now, this is a moment for a brief bit of humor. Over the years, I've gotten a number of emails, letters, postcards, even phone calls from people who say, loved your book, hated the chapter on the labyrinth. I'd love to go with you to France or to Greece, but can we just avoid all that labyrinth business? Oh, sorry, there's no story without the dark side of the moon, the dark side of the soul, the labyrinth. The labyrinth reflects the fact that you are pushing yourself, pushing your, in the best sense of the word push, your spirit down into soul. This is a very easy way to think about the difference between soul and spirit. Spirit is the movement up into the light, the movement up into the heavens. Soul, the soul of your life, is down in the darkness. St. John's dark night of the soul. Some people never come back from the labyrinth. That's called depression or addiction. Despair is labyrinth language. However, if you keep moving, you will arrive. You see the stage for arrival there. You arrive, and in my book, You can spend much more time there. I have a whole set of different exercises and practices that I really recommend, because if you get to the Taj Mahal or Borobudur or Angkor Wat or let's say the monastery in the Sinai, with St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, and you haven't prepared, and you're thinking about partying, or you're angry about something out there in the world, nothing will happen at the site. Remember, I've also done 8 films on war, several films on political movements, and I've noticed a pattern that when people are angry, they have not dealt with their own spiritual issues, their own spiritual trouble. Nothing happens politically. Nothing changes. So there is a way, and these are practices I've borrowed from many, many different traditions. So you can land on the one that works for you. You can arrive, something will happen. You will find a turn in the soul, a lifting of your spirit, and an answer of some sort often happens at the point of arrival in these sacred journeys. Some of you may know, may or may not know, the word epiphany has become quite popular now, but it was strictly a theological word for centuries. It actually dates back to the Greeks. It means the shining forth of light in the darkness, epiphanos. But it was not used in common usage until James Joyce. He used it, in his short story, The Dead, in the Dubliners, to describe the moment when the heart turns and someone sees the truth of their life. Since James Joyce, we've been using it in everyday life and not just theological life. Epiphany is a pilgrim word. I believe it's at the heart of so much of this resurgence of the need for pilgrimage. The people want an answer, but they want an experience, not a theory. And then you see the final return here. I'll be talking in a few more minutes then about the boon as we end up here. The boon being a great old word from the myths, which essentially means the gift. The boon is always a metaphor for wisdom. The boon means wisdom. What did you learn on that project about saving the oyster mounds here in Berkeley, California, that were planted, that were created by the local Indians here for thousands of years? What was the gift when you went with a group like I did? I took 22 16-year-olds to Iona, Scotland, because they were spiritually in crisis, and I tried to do something to help. The boon is something we could talk about in our Q&A. I ask this of my participants in my tours every night. We go to a magnificent site, maybe in Athens or Ithaca, or if we're in Turkey, we go to the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. At the end of the day, I will ask, what was the gift? What was the boon? What was your La Dolce Vita moment? It's a good practice. Slide, please. I'm using this as a kind of breath here. The difference in pilgrimage is that it's got a spiritual focus. And I don't mean theological. I mean the life force that is in us. If you are spiritually minded, or traditionally, you might believe it's the breath that came from God, as we see on the Sistine Chapel, that breath that goes into Adam. That's fine. It's a Christian mythology to think of it that way. But spiritual focus, even politically here, as MLK, Martin Luther King, talked about, the American spirit was wounded. The American spirit need to be renewed, which is why 500,000 people then followed him to Washington, and many thousands participated in the Montgomery bus boycott. Slide, please. Just to show you that this word is used in many sides. I led a peace pilgrimage, it was called, a few years ago, with Father John Deere, the anti-war activist. And we led it from Thomas Merton's Hermitage in Gethsemane to Louisville, about 25 miles a day. almost 100 of us joining up, and we were marching for peace in honor of Merton and Muhammad and Gandhi. So this is something I found on the internet. Someone took a line from my book, The Art of Pilgrimage, and then turned it into an image here. So I'm asking in my book, imagine your departure and the way, what I call the Pilgrim's Way, as a metamorphosis. You are not just going in the aggressive tourist model, which is just consume, take a picture, take home a souvenir. Tourists tend to be on the take. The pilgrim / artist / political activist is concerned about the inner life of herself and the inner life of the place. So metamorphosis, another great Greek word, I think is at the heart of pilgrimage. So what kind of change are you looking for? Is the question I would ask you if you were going to take a tour with me. If you were coming to Chartres Cathedral, where I just taught for a week, just a month ago, what kind of change are you imagining? Slide, please. Oh, here we are. I forgot this was in here. It's a few of the people on my Gandhi Merton March, walking every day. This was just a few minutes before, I don't know, 75 Hell's Angels roared by us. And I thought for sure they were going to stop us and call us a bunch of weaklings. Oh, you peaceniks. I was terrible stereotyping, right? I was expecting some kind of row. But as they passed by, the whole group looks at me because I'm in the lead here with Father John Deere. And instead, I hold up the peace symbol. And the leader, this guy with the long Hell's Angels beard, looked around and he was really surprised. And then he flashed the peace signal, and all of the other motorcyclists did the same thing. And I just shouted out, "We're on a peace pilgrimage." And it worked. It's got its own kind of wonder. So what I'm quoting here is a recent book, another book by the great Irish mystic priest John O'Donoghue, a compilation of some radio interviews that were held just before he died. He and I co-led a tour around Ireland. Just, I think it was 2 months before he passed. I was staggered. And one of his wonderful metaphors was that the pilgrim is walking in wonder. Isn't that marvelous? Not just walking to see famous things, not just walking to check a box off, 1,000 places to see before you die. The pilgrim, the activist, the artist is walking in wonder. I recently found out an incredible poem by a woman, Rebecca Elson, who was a groundbreaking, if you can say groundbreaking, astronomer, skybreaking, a skybreaking astronomer and a poet, a rare combination. And her most famous poem is called A Responsibility to Awe, AWE. And that's what she felt her role in science was. I know so many of you believe in the sanctity of science, and I'm not mixing my metaphors here. I recommend that you find this poem by her, that we can observe, we can calculate the world as scientists, but our responsibility is to pass on the awe and wonder that we feel about it, as John did his whole life. Slide, please. So this is the way. We just take a breath. We're walking to the site. If you can imagine the place that you might want to go to bring about either personal or social change. This is an image of the Hokkaido, Hokkaido, Hokkaido pilgrimage, which is in the footsteps of the famous poet in the Japanese islands. And I love the notion of you can see the footprints in this beautiful old lithograph here, because feet, prints, steps are all part of the wonderful mythology of the way. A lot of our language, as we finish up here, we just have a few more slides, is embedded in movement. Saunter, our wonderful word, saunter, comes from santerre, the old Latin and the old French for the Holy Land. Santerre is the Holy Land, and the saunter is the pace that you would have been on about 20 miles a day if you were healthy and the weather was remotely good. you would take about 20 miles a day to walk from somewhere in Europe to Rome or Jerusalem to the Holy Land. That gives us our word saunter. Next slide, please. A journey itself is the old word to describe how much distance you cover in one jour, a day, French for day. So this is the road going up to the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. I just love the geometry of this. And it's bringing in two of the principles, very easy to remember from my book and my teaching, and probably an overlap with all of your work. And that is in pilgrimage, in creativity, two main things are important: sacred space and sacred time. There is no pilgrimage unless you are going to not any space, but sacred space. And have you carved out sacred time for this? That's why I see so many overlaps between even writing a book and writing a pilgrimage, so to speak. Slide, please. So here's an unusual image. I mentioned kairos, right, for clock, chronological time. Do you remember from your theological teachings? And now it's in the writings of some famous architects and futurists today, kairos. Kairos time is sacred time, holy time. It's the time of synchronicity. This is the only known sculpture of kairos. It's who knows why all the others would have been destroyed, but this was found in a nunnery in Yugoslavia on the inside of a sarcophagus. So this is the god of sacred time. And I'm urging this to say, honor this when you are meeting together as a group. Honor sacred time, honor kairos when you're considering a political statement, a movement, a documentary, a book, a magazine that might come out of this. You see what he's doing? He's touching the scales of fate, which means if you make your time sacred, you are not a victim of time, a victim of the gods. You are slightly shifting fate in your own terms. You are tipping the scales. This is where the phrase comes from. So in all my work, in myth, in tours, in creativity, filmmaking, I'm always trying to be aware of this distinction between ordinary time and extraordinary time. This is what helps us distinguish between pilgrimage and tourism. A slide, please. Just have a couple more here. This is from just a couple of years ago, one of my many tours. I lead writing retreats here to Paris. I'm looking at my window, and it seemed to be an ordinary dusk. And then suddenly the light became preposterously beautiful, to coin a phrase. And it looks like a Pierre Bonnard painting behind. And now the window frame becomes, to me, a portal. This, I'm trying to give you a simple practice here for travel, that if you take a breath, you slow down, you will see portals everywhere. The portal is the opening to the truth of a place, the truth of, let's say, the indignity of poverty in some place, or the beauty of innovation in another place. We have to know how to pay attention for the portals to actually open. So this is an image game to help you with that. Slide, please. Here's an image from my new book, which I'm working on the proofs of today and tonight and tomorrow. Who stole the arms of the Venus de Milo? Yeah. If you want to know, you've got to buy the book. So, I hope that's not mean-spirited. I've been working on this for 22 years. I actually began it the night of, oh, this is an unusual coincidence, September 11th, 2001. I was flying into New York that morning, and we hit the tarmac at 10 minutes to 9, at the precise moment the first plane hit the first tower. I had a book signing in the Twin Towers at the Rizzoli bookstore at 11 a.m. So all my family back here in California thought that I had died. I was in the towers. And because life was so chaotic for the first couple of days, I met my publisher who found me a hotel. We met for a while and he said, just keep going, keep going, keep going. People will come from all over the country. I did 22 cities and 21 cities in 21 days for my book that time, Once and Future Myths. But what I needed to fuel, and this is one of the, I hope this is coming through, one of the formulas here. The pilgrimage is the journey you take to renew your spiritual energy. If you feel yourself getting snarky or sarcastic or holier than thou, any of those, intolerant, you need a pilgrimage. You need an injection of sacred energy from some site somewhere in the world. That first night in New York, when my world was demolished, and I'm walking through Manhattan and I'm feeling all the refuse, the black ash falling from the sky all night. I needed something to combat the terror, the horror of what I saw. So I walked clear across New York to go to the Met to look at a handful of Vermeer paintings. I needed some beauty. And this word pilgrimage, I because of this book, I've been interviewing curators in museums all around the world, and they say this word is being used over and over again from visitors who say, I came here specially to see the Picasso or the Mary Cassatt or the Venus de Milo, whatever it might be, because people, they're groping for a word to say, I need a charge of energy, I need a charge of beauty. And this is part of my book. The book will be out in November, and I hope you all enjoy it. Next slide, please. Just a couple more here. You will get stuck. If you don't, I would argue that you haven't been on a true pilgrimage. This is a Chartres Cathedral, but it's the cobblestone labyrinth outside in the gardens of the monastery next to Chartres Cathedral. And of course, most of you probably know this better than me. It's an ancient motif that goes back to Malta. The Aborigines in Australia have labyrinth-like images. Crete, of course, with the Minotaur. The Christian phenomena began in the 11th century when, surprisingly, people stopped going to church, especially women. This is an unknown phenomena of Christianity. Women stopped going. They felt left out of the hierarchy. So cathedrals were put up all over Europe in honor of who? Not Jesus. They're in honor of Mary. And so they put labyrinths inside. And if you couldn't go all the way to Rome or Picasso's house in Spain, you imagine you went to the local cathedral and you walked the labyrinth as if, this is the great as if active imagination game, as if you were on a pilgrimage. Slide, please. So let's say you have arrived, you've kept moving, you've been anxious, you've been nervous, you've been confused. All of these are qualities of pilgrimage. I tend to think it means that you're moving towards an answer. If it came to you the first day you landed, it probably isn't the right answer. That's just too easy. The answer to the big puzzle, the big question in your life, will take some coaxing to get to. And inevitably, there will be some pain, some confusion, sometimes some anger involved, but you keep moving. So here is one image of this. I like to ask people every night in a banquet, so that it's not overly intellectual. I'll just say, what was your moment of wonder today? What was the moment of awe and wonder or beauty? What would you remember? And on the march in honor of Gandhi and Thomas Merton, people talked about their feet more than anything else, even more than their spiritual salvation, because it was 25 miles a day for a week. That's a long time, right? And so a woman responded to this on the trip, and she began taking patterns of all of our footprints. When she got home, she made a quilt of our footprints. And then she sent the quilt to the Muhammad Ali Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where we ended our pilgrimage. Muhammad Ali contacted us and said, I have been a man of violence all my life. Now I'm a man of peace. would you please honor me by ending your pilgrimage here? See, it's pretty cool, isn't it? This is a pilgrimage in the real world. So I ask people, when you are going home, the last few days of a journey, what can you make? Not just think about, but what can you make? A book, a photo collection, a new perfume, a quilt. This has been a tradition throughout world pilgrimage where you make something upon return. Slide, please. Sorry, I lost you here. Sorry. All right, I lost you there.
You should have a slide with the Tibetan monk.
Right. I'm trying to get it back. Does anybody know how to get? I just slid it off to the side. Oh, crap. Just give me a moment here. Take a breath, say a prayer. Well, I can look at it this way. The arrival slide. This is an image from an episode I shot for my show on PBS called Global Spirit, which ran for 10 years, in which I was able to interview 2 or 3 people from different cultures around the world on one single theme, which is very unusual in today's world. And then PBS sent me to India with our film team. And we're in Bodh Gaya, which is the place of illumination for the Buddha. And I noticed this marvelously focused Tibetan nun. And through an interpreter, I took this photo, and through an interpreter, I found out she walked from Tibet. It had taken her many, many months to get there. But you can see with that expression in her eyes, she was deeply focused. And I use this as a kind of, how can you say, standard for my own focus when I'm traveling, but also when I'm writing, or even when I'm playing father to my son. How focused am I on this encounter, on this moment? And I often will conjure this wonderful, beautiful face up to say, this is someone who is there and no other place on earth. Slide, please. This is the Wailing Wall, of course. When I was working on a kibbutz, it was in Israel in the mid-70s, it was announced that there was going to be the Jerusalem March, 29 miles from the Sea of Galilee. And we arrived at midday and went up to present ourselves to the Wailing Wall, or some say the Wall of Solomon. And I use this here as again, another lovely metaphor of touch. We will say, or our therapist will say, or our partners will say, hey, you're out of touch. You're out of touch with reality. You're out of touch with your true self, or the culture is out of touch. And that's why the fields are burning in the Burning Man Festival, or the Middle East is on fire, whatever it might be. Surprisingly, but also elegantly, getting back in touch is one of the metaphors in pilgrimage. We are slightly askew. We go to a sacred site, and with our hands, or in this case, our foreheads, this is the forehead that's being used in Jerusalem. You touch that wall, or maybe if you're lucky, you're in the Louvre and you get to touch an old Greek piece of sculpture. Some are allowed and some aren't. Or like me, going to the Baseball Hall of Fame, I was allowed to hold Babe Ruth's bat. What do all these have in common? Touch. This metaphor that touch is an important issue in our spiritual life, but also in our physical life, getting back in touch. Next slide, please. These 3 shots are just from Chartres, just a few weeks ago. Every night they have a Sonne Lumière, a sound and light show, which gives you a sense of how this cathedral was put up in the 1100s, how it was restored many times over, just the sheer beauty and the fact that they're playing Gregorian chant late at night. Hundreds of people are converged on the small plateau in front of the cathedral, out of what? A sense of glory, and a sense of going back to the beginning. All these pilgrimage sites are a sense of going back to where something, let's say your faith or your family. For me, in southern France, near the Lascaux Caves, that's where the Cousineaux came from. You go back to the beginning to get spiritually recharged. Next slide, please. Just 3 more. Here, I can't resist this. This is my friend John O'Donoghue. When we co-led a tour together around Ireland, we went to the ruins of this beautiful old church. And he told me that just a few weeks before, he had said his last mass, that he was leaving the church so he could get married. He had found the love of his life. And he had announced through different channels that he was going to say Easter Mass at the ruins of this old cathedral. 250,000 people from all over Ireland came and stood for 2.5 hours in the pouring Irish, what they would call slashing rain, to listen to John sing and give a blessing. And in some way, that's the heart of what's different also between pilgrimage, tourism, and mere documentation. I'm a documentary filmmaker, but there can be mere. It's just I don't get in the way. My beliefs will never get into this. The blessing that you get on a pilgrimage is what makes an enormous difference to your spiritual life. This is the Hill of Crosses in Lithuania. You see, you're obliged when you go to this site, and most actually in the world. We seem to have lost that in America. You go to a pilgrimage site, a special site, you take a gift. It's incomprehensible in most sacred sites in the world that you would go empty-handed. So when you go to the Hill of Crosses in Lithuania, you take a cross. Next slide, please. So are we caught up? Is this Kefi?
This is the crosses.
Okay, so the next slide then, the Kefi. Are you in the Greek islands with me? I wanted to make sure we're on the same. Okay, that's Anthony Quinn going back to Crete 40 some years after filming Zorba the Greek. And I use this here because I learned on Crete, there's this gorgeous word called Kefi, K-E-F-I, which is a sudden surge of joy. See, I needed 5 or 6 words to say that in English. The Greeks need 1. And I'm using this here for another distinction. Pilgrimage is not just about torturing the body. I have seen the self-flagellators in the Philippines, so I know that kind of cruel pilgrimage. That's the sin of literalism. But the kind I'm fascinated by, and I hope is useful to you, is one in which you end up celebrating. You end up dancing the beauty of the world. And then 2 more. We have 2 more slides here. The next one, please. Okay. Do you have Odysseus here?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a bust of Odysseus right on Stavros in the heart of Ithaca. And I use this because of this whole notion of pilgrimage, going back to your spiritual home to be spiritually recharged, overlapping with ecology, which is what I learned. I interviewed Mary Catherine Bateson, who is Margaret Mead's daughter and Gregory Bateson's daughter. And she was an engineer, a futurist in her own right. And in my interview, our interview with her for this film on eco-design, she said, we have to remember that this is our home. Oikos is home in ancient Greek. And ecology comes from that. So Mary Catherine Bateson asks a very simple question of us. Are you or are you not taking care of home? Which means your family, your tribe, your neighborhood, your planet. Or in Brian Swim's case, in his new book, Cosmogenesis, the universe itself. And this one site, Ithaca, this tiny island in the Aegean, has symbolized this urge to go back and take care of home, be reunited with your home. Or it's about a 3,000-year-old story. Now, I urge you all to reread it. So the last slide, reflections, is the sunset at Angkor Wat, my last night there. And I simply want to end with this brief notion of the absolute need on your last night of a pilgrimage, or let's say some political activist work that you're doing. You have a conference for 3 days in Cape Town, South Africa, wherever it might be. The need to reflect on your journey, on your work, is not as easy as it sounds. We are in such a frenetic world right now that people are going from one event, one experience, one cause to the next without much reflection in between. Reflection in a journal, in a diary, maybe a long, soulful conversation with your dearest, deepest friend. Without the reflection, the experience does not hit home. You see, we're back to that notion of home again. So maybe we can take a pause there on reflection. Take a minute or so to think about reflection, how you reflect. Do you have a practice of reflections? Do you draw, sing, dance? What is your practice? While I try to bring back my my Zoom presentation with all of you. John, any idea how to get this back?
I don't know what you're looking at, I'm sorry. Right now, we're on the reflection and the image on the wall of Angkor Wat.
Right. And that's fine, but I've lost all of you.
Okay, what I can do is stop sharing. And how's that? Okay.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at our audience and you as Megan.
So can you actually see me? Because I can't see anybody.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It's my fault. The great filmmaker can't figure out his own laptop, right? Irony of ironies.
Minimizing the screen, maybe it's underneath somewhere.
It is. It's hiding from me. Just give me another minute, or maybe you can start.
I think you can do Phyllis question and answers at this point, and we can open it up to the virtual audience.
Okay, yeah, let's start. I'm fine to go ahead, please. And if you can tell me your name when you ask a question, raise an issue. Who would like to go first?
Well, Phil, this is John, and I really enjoyed your presentation on pilgrimage. It reminds me of my own.
And how does it make you look back at your own travels then?
The expectation of going and perhaps what I remember receiving, and then the journey back.
What was the greatest gift that you ever received from one of your journeys?
The spirit of brotherhood.
Oh. So my metaphor of being spiritually recharged, reintegrated, revivified. You see, this is one of the great little grammar tricks. What the pilgrimage, the sacred journey does, put an RE in front of it. You're revived, you're reintegrated, rejuvenated. I think that's why the pilgrimages, no one forces anyone. Well, maybe in some cases, but generally, it's an act of volition. It's an act of will. It takes time, energy, money, health. Here's a startling fact. Is it Anthony Burgess of Clockwork Orange fame, if you remember him? He wrote a majestic book on the history of the Grand Tour. If you recall, it was considered absolutely necessary for someone of culture to go to, from London, to go to Paris, and then onwards to Vienna, Salzburg, Rome, Jerusalem. That was considered the grand tour, to round out your personality. And only then could you consider yourself educated. Just going to Eton and Oxford was not enough. So in the middle of this wonderful book, he says a startling thing, that up until the mid-19th century, roughly half of the world's travelers who left home never returned. It was because it was expensive, it was dangerous, there was disease in a lot of the country inns. There were, if you left, let's say you walked from London all the way to Rome, you may have encountered 2 or 3 different wars, or at least battles within wars. So many people died, which is why there was a certain almost ferocity to the spiritual quest throughout the Middle Ages. You are going because you have to. Spiritually, you have to make this trip. And one of the practices was to go and fill out a last will and testament. Also, to go and say your goodbyes with your family, to the village priest or the rabbi or the imam. That's how dangerous it was. So underneath this layer, almost a lapidary-like nature of this tradition of pilgrimage, is this sense that it's always been dangerous. It's a bit of a risk to you in every sense of the term, but the rewards are immense. The reward being that the journey, this whatever sacred at this site that you have in your mind, might shine light on your spiritual crisis. So you're willing to risk the journey. Somebody else?
Bill, I'm looking at your book, the Art of Pilgrimage.
Yes.
He sent me about 5 books. I tripped over a big box in my doorway. I didn't even know it was out there. And I got these books as I started to read. Anyway, this it gives you a journey in chapters. The longing, the call, the departure, the pilgrim's way, the labyrinth, and the arrival. And when you were just talking now about your journey, I guess those are the steps I went through for my own journey. It did start in chaos and in what you said, like a crisis. Yeah. And as a result of that crisis, I have tried to answer a scripture quote, and people here have heard me say this 1,000 times. I've come to light a fire on this earth. How I wish it were emblazoned already. That's Luke 12:49. And I have tried to, in my life, live with that in mind all the time. So I really am grateful for your, not only the presentation, but also the book that showed you how to do this. And I just finished reading Cosmogenesis by Brian Swim.
Yes.
Oh my God. I just am so excited about his journey, and he finally found out what he was supposed to do. So, thank you. Other people probably have other things to say.
Well, yeah, for those who don't know, Brian is a cosmologist. He has devoted his life to studying the origins of the universe, but with a different twist, which is the personal. What does it personally mean to him as a scientist to encounter the awe and wonder of the world? Coincidentally, sister, today, a magazine called the New Ecozoic Reader. Ecozoic, you might remember this from Thomas Berry. A magazine completely devoted to that book has just come out today with contributions from about 12 different essayists. So if any of you are interested in some of these ideas, please look for that, the New Ecozoic Reader. And also, just a little hint, I'm working on a future workshop in Chartres Cathedral with Brian for next year. So if any of you are interested in coming and studying the origins of the universe, the origins of pilgrimage, maybe the origins of your own creativity, please join us in France next year. Thank you. And by the way, the 7 stages that you just enunciated there come from the anthropologists who study rites of passage. There's Claude Lévi-Strauss, Paul Radin, so many others who would travel the world, and they found out that throughout history, every known culture has had a ritual and or ceremony to help individuals cross thresholds. A young boy to become a man, a young girl to become a woman, but a middle age rite of passage is often required. And also the latter stages of life. There's a threshold between middle age and then let's call it elderhood. How's that for a word? And all of these require attention, ceremony, a belief that these changes are sacred. And they tend to come in threes. There is the separation from who you were, your old self, a drop down into the underworld, a drop into anxiety and confusion. And if you have the courage, if you have the heart, the direction, and you keep going, then the third stage, of course, is coming home again. And that became the model for Campbell in the famous hero's journey. And then the model for my pilgrim's journey. And I suspect it's why when people listen to even this brief rendition of my presentation, a lot of this will just seem absolutely obvious. Of course you leave home, and of course you're going to have some troubles on the road, but you need mentors, you need allies. If you're lucky, you'll encounter someone angelic like. This is in all of the world folklore, that if you go on a journey to find yourself, there will be invisible hands that will reach out and help you. This is from ancient Arabia to Africa. Every culture has these images. So I've tried to condense into 250 pages or so these basic rites of passage to help you, all of you who are listening tonight, because they've helped me in my travels around the world. So thank you, sister.
Thank you, Phil. I think it's about time we got to cut here because people got to get to other things like sleep and preparation for school, etc. But anyway, we'd like to thank you very much for everything that you've said tonight. It's been a very, very spiritual hour and a half. It has been a very, very spiritual one.
Well,
and
thank
I'd like
you.
to.
And you gave me a great challenge to try to find an overlap in my own life, my own work, in which I deeply believed that there is such a thing as the soul of the world, but that it has to be protected, which is where the ecological movement overlaps with the spiritual movement. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. If you want to see this again and refer to it, it's on YouTube. And so, please, it's recorded or it's recording, but it'll be on. So that's what you want to do is go to YouTube and go to Science Alliance Save, and then you'll find that. And then we have our next lecture, which is on November, I forgot what day it is actually. 14th. November 14th. Yeah. And this is from Bethlehem Farms. And Eileen Ripson was one who connected me to that person. And so he's going to do teaching sustainable practices at Bethlehem Farm. So thank you all for coming tonight. I hope that you can go home thinking about pilgrimage, the soul of the world, and see where that takes each one of us. Amen. Okay, thank you. Good night, everybody.